PTSD is an incredibly sensitive and debilitating experiences that people can go through. What's up, everybody? It's your boy Umar Farouk. You're watching Traumadelic Healing. I am a trauma-informed therapist. Today I wanted to talk about the difference between ACEs and PTSD/CPTSD. So in my last video, I pointed out the difference between having high levels of adversity versus having actual PTSD. And to say the least, a few TikTokers weren't quite satisfied with the way I defined trauma and PTSD and resilience. So here's the video, clarifying and also giving you my perspective as someone who worked with trauma and PTSD, especially complex PTSD. So before we go into the video, we should define what trauma is, what is the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, as well as what does resiliency factors mean. Oh, and also ACEs. We want to talk about what ACEs are. As a clinician, when I am treating patients, to me, all that needs to qualify as trauma or a traumatic event, rather, or an event that induces some trauma is something that puts you in harm's way, puts you in a fight or flight response, and genuinely feels like your life is being threatened, whether it's symbolically, for example, a family threatening to disown you, maybe they find something out about your identity, or actually physically, where you're being pinned down by a bunch of rubble and your body is trying to force its way out. It's in fight or flight and it can't quite push off the rubble. Maybe even being called a name, slurs or nicknames can also technically be traumatic. Everyone's trauma is unique to their own experience, and there's no reason to say your trauma is worse than someone else's or someone else's trauma is worse than yours. Trauma is a very subjective and relative experience to your own identity, your own life, and the amounts of resiliency factors you had opportunities to engage with. So what is the difference between trauma and PTSD? PTSD is the byproduct of trauma that doesn't get processed. If you are in a situation where your environment gaslights you, or maybe you are not allowing yourself to feel the emotion that comes out of the trauma, or if you weren't able to fight or run your way out of the traumatic event, the trauma then gets stuck in the body somewhere. Essentially, while you're going through the traumatic event, your amygdala is going off. It's telling your body to go into fight or flight. Your hippocampus, which is right next to the amygdala, I believe, I could be wrong, starts to understand, it starts to pair the memory or the experience of the traumatic event with a negative emotion, with the fight or flight. The problem is, because it doesn't get processed, your brain starts to become stuck on this memory even after the event. It'll start taking you back to a flashback of the event, and because the memory is paired with a fight or flight response, your body will become hyper aroused emotionally and it'll get triggered and bring PTSD flashbacks. There's also hallucinations, especially for survivals of sexual assault. There's also dissociation, nightmares, and the list goes on. CPTSD is a variation of PTSD. It is a form of PTSD that you're exposed to over time. So for example, you coming home from school and you're having to constantly confront a emotionally abusive or emotionally manipulative parent or caregiver to the point where you're in fight or flight mode every single day. Each event might not be PTSD inducing in and of itself, but altogether it's formulated enough cortisol or adrenaline receptors in your body to the point your body starts to become hyper aroused. CPTSD can look like ADHD presenting symptoms. You can dissociate instead of be distractible. You can be hypervigilant instead of hyperactive. You can be dissociative instead of inattentive. So on and so forth. I have another video covering that. Essentially, your brain is doing the same thing. It's stuck, and it has the trauma or the accumulation of the trauma stuck in the body somewhere, and it hasn't had the opportunity to be processed. Resiliency factors, on the other hand, resilience is not your ability to be strong-willed. Resilience is not mental toughness. This is an illusion that is being spread that stigmatizes people with mental health issues, stigmatizes everyday people, rather, and stigmatizes people suffering from PTSD. Resiliency factors are identified as the things in your environment that help boost your sense of empowerment, resilience, and your ability to feel safe enough to process the emotion. So an example of a resiliency factor would be your caregiver being able to provide quality food, water, shelter due to having a livable income. Also, your caregiver being emotionally available so that when you have a traumatic moment, or if you have even a stressful moment, they allow space for you to healthily express your emotion and let the emotion pass. Things in your environment that allow you to feel like you might not have to mask today, or like hide your traumas or hide what you're going through. So again, When I talk about resiliency factors, I am strictly talking about your environment that was there for you. This is kind of why some people might go through the same event, the same traumatic event, and one person might come out with PTSD and one person might not. Not because the event wasn't traumatic, but because the other person might have enough resiliency factors to be able to process the trauma. Maybe their caregiver or their therapist or someone in their circle helped them process the emotion, let them be as angry as they needed to be after the trauma, let them be as sad as they needed to be, let them cry, and they were able to get the emotion out of their system. This is very hard as the body needs to be stable and regulated and avoid being triggered to a fight or flight response in order to process the emotion. Once the fight or flight response is triggered, the body becomes hijacked and any chance of your human brain to be able to process the trauma is kind of thrown out the window until you re-regulate again. This is why it's so incredibly difficult to treat PTSD, but this is also why it is doable. So what do ACEs have to do with all of this? If you don't know, ACEs is growing in popularity in the field of mental health and therapy and research. It stands for the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it essentially measures the levels of adversity you grew up with before turning the age of 18.
Ask a doc who the illest is. Ask the psych when my medicine.
In my last video, I said to be careful about equating your ACE score with you having PTSD. The reason why is because the ACEs test does not measure how traumatized you are. Your ACEs score is not directly correlated to your how severe your PTSD is. Rather, it's more so correlated with the adversities you went through and how your adversities can contribute to long-term negative health outcomes, such as autoimmune diseases, such as cancer, such as any addiction-related diseases, so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say, theoretically, you can have a 10 out of 10 on the ACEs score and be able to leave without any PTSD if you have good resiliency factors that allowed you to process the trauma and allow it to leave your body. On the flip side, you can have one score on the ACEs survey and be severely traumatized because there was not much resiliency factors or quality social determinants of health in your environment to help you process the emotion. The ACEs score, 1, comes in the spectrum, and 2, so does PTSD. PTSD presenting symptoms and trauma come in a form of a spectrum. And no, that does not mean the more strong-willed you are and the more quote-unquote resilient you are, the better you will be in the face of PTSD, because that's not true. If you neglect your emotional needs and if people around you neglect your emotional needs, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have PTSD after a traumatic event. Absolutely. I would highly recommend looking into the resiliency questionnaire as opposed to the ACEs questionnaire, where the ACEs score tells you how much adversity you might have been through your entire life. The resiliency questionnaire, I'll put a link in the description down below, measures the quality and the quantity of resiliency factors you've been through. This isn't a perfect score either, just like ACEs, but I think it'd be a cool comparison to look at the ACEs score along with the resiliency questionnaire score as opposed to looking at either one of them alone. PTSD is an incredibly sensitive and debilitating experiences that people can go through. PTSD can make it super difficult to navigate through social environments and participate in important areas of social functioning. We need to bring awareness to PTSD without stigmatizing it further, without invalidating the experience of others. Therefore, when someone tells you they have a lot of trauma, believe them. I also think we should take the issue of the lack of resiliency factors in our environment a little bit more seriously. There should be more support in policy to provide health care for everybody, to provide quality education for everybody, to provide food and social safety nets in place that help to prevent trauma. Social and systemic factors can also create PTSD. It's not just someone got into a car accident and they got PTSD. PTSD is very complicated, hence the word complex PTSD. Anyways, I don't know if I missed anything. If I did, I'll be sure to leave something on the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. And I'll be sure to try to see if I can answer that. Or if not, I'll make another video. If you have any recommendations of what I should talk about, I'll be happy to do that. This is Omar Farouk. You're watching Traumadelic Healing. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to wash your hands, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.